Okay, everybody, it's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. Just to remind you all, my day job is publishing this magazine, Skeptic magazine. Here's our latest issue on race matters, part of our sequence this year of matters issues. This is on abortion matters, pro-life versus pro-choice versus whatever else somebody may adhere to. And then our first one of the year for 2022 was trans matters, everything you need to know about trans matters. As you can see, we're branching out from debunking astrology and psychics and UFOs to a little more culturally pertinent issues. I think we may actually do one on sex matters after today's guest and her new book. She is Louise, and the case against the sexual revolution. Louise Perry. Let me give you a proper introduction here. She's a writer, new Statesman columnist, and campaigner against male sexual violence. Her new book, again, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, sparked an international conversation about sex in the 21st century. Indeed, it has. I've seen quite a bit of media coverage you've had. How
Yeah.
how have you perceived the reception of the book so far?
Uh, Copious and more positive than I was expecting.
Oh, more positive. Okay, you were
Yeah.
expecting pushback from whom?
Everyone really. I mean, and it has. It's had sort of criticism from every angle you can imagine, really. But I'd say that even so, probably 90% of responses I've had have been hugely positive, and from people of every demographic and of every political and faith background. Again, that you can imagine.
Interesting. Yeah. So yours
Mm.
is the reason I brought that up. That maybe we should do an issue on this. My regular columnist is Skeptic Carol Tavris, who's a kind of a second wave feminist, has just written a large review essay of your book, plus Christine Emba's Rethinking Sex, a Provocation, and Nona Willis Aronvitz's Bad Sex, Truth, Pleasure, and an Unfinished Revolution, and throwing in Bridget Fettisy's Substack essay, Beyond Parody, which, as Carol says, unfortunately isn't. In which she calls herself a slut and basically learned the hard way. If I recall, she saw your dedication to your book, which is, I think, to the women who learned it the hard way,
Yeah.
right? And that she was one of those. So what's why this book at this time and these other books? What's going on here culturally?
It's clearly something, isn't it? Yeah, I haven't read the Willis book, but I've read Ember and I've obviously read Bridget's essay. And there are a few others in that vein as well that have been published in recent years. I mean, I think we've probably just hit the high watermark of what is commonly described as sex positive feminism, which is, I mean, sort of to steelman it is uh, a movement that emerges in the 80s and 90s, sort of in reaction against what was read as the anti-sex views of radical feminists like Andrew Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon. Sex positive feminism said that actually, sex could be wonderful, that it didn't have to be kind of weighed down either with the old forms of Christian shame or with newer forms of political shame imposed by feminist analysis, that actually it could be a site of joy and experimentation, and that there wasn't anything inherently bad about any kind of sex. It was just important that everyone was consenting. The problem, I think, with that theory, which it kind of works, I think it's a little like communism. Maybe true sex positive feminism has never been tried, but it's something that tends to work very well in theory, but not very well in practice. The way that it works in practice, I argue, is that it really just excuses exploitative and predatory sexual behavior, mostly committed by men. And I think that's becoming apparent to women who've grown up under that, in an era when that was the mainstream position. All of those names you mentioned just now, they're all millennials, really. This is the first generation to have uh, come of age at a time when the old Christian sexual morality was really dead in a ditch. If you came from even a remotely kind of secular progressive background, you would not expect to be bound by any of those ideas. And I think that we've experienced the costs in our generation. I think that actually the younger generation have experienced them even more so. So I think it's not surprising that we're seeing a backlash. The question, I guess, is what direction it goes in from here.
Right. Well, so give us a little kind of background. What was the sexual revolution, or what is it, I guess, and when did it start? And then wrap up into that first, second, and third wave feminism and whatever it is we're in now.
So first wave feminism is normally used to describe suffrage, so the late 19th, early 20th century. And then the second wave is normally said to start with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex publication in 1945, but it really gets going in the 60s and 70s, which is, of course, when the sexual revolution is generally taken to have begun. I think that the sexual revolution is really two things in parallel. One is ideological. You have a very sort of fervid ideological moment coming out of the Second World War, and a mood of revolution and tearing down boundaries and all this kind of stuff, including obviously sexual ones. And then you have that tied to the invention of the pill, which is an amazing technology shock, which suddenly allows women to control their reproduction in a way that they haven't been able to before. And hot on the heels of that comes the decriminalization of abortion. And then all of a sudden, there isn't really a concrete link between sex and reproduction anymore, which is earth shattering. And so that material change and that ideological change in tandem, I think, is what the sexual revolution is. Third wave feminism is more controversial. It's normally taken to be sort of 1990s onwards. But there are a lot of, I mean, we're still living that history, so I don't think that we're settled on what exactly was the outcome of the third wave, except that it certainly involved this move towards being more sex positive, towards being more liberal in some ways, although not in others. I mean, there's a kind of tension, I think, with the kind of feminism that on the one hand is extremely permissive on some sexual matters, but then is extremely restrictive on some issues to do with speech, and on some areas of sexual life. I think that internal contradiction is built in, because I think that it's a movement that's trying to erase sexual differences in a way that one can never do. It's a completely impossible task, and so the project therefore ends up having some slightly perverse outcomes.
Yeah, there's a lot of blank slateism there, where
Yes.
there's no biological differences between men and women. Therefore, we can do whatever we want without consequences. And so your point is that there are consequences, because there are differences between men and women. So we'll get into that in just a second. But I wrote a book called The Moral Arc, and I have a chapter on women's rights. And most of what you just said sounds good, positive. The long arc of the moral universe. Women are more empowered, freer, more autonomous. You can make your own choices. You don't not dependent on men forcing you or coercing you to do things. What's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, I don't. One way in which I probably differ from most feminists is that I think that feminists' progress, if we want to call it that, has not really been driven by feminist campaigning, even though feminist campaigning has had some role to play, and I do it. I don't think it's pointless. But I think that the main spur to all of these changes, which are really to do with women just participating more in public life and spending less time at home, has a lot more to do with technology. The fact that it just takes a lot less labor now to run a home than it used to means that women can go out and do the sort of paid work that they just practically couldn't previously. The pill obviously is another factor there, because it allows us to delay or even forego childbearing while still being sexually active. And we also have different types of work increasingly. The really high earning professional jobs that pretty much doesn't matter if you have a male or a female body. You can they just require a brain and a laptop. Whereas of course in the past, much more emphasis on male strength in many of the most important jobs. Automation and industrialization has done away with that gradually over time. So So I'm not sure. There's sometimes a sort of slightly crude history of this period, which is almost like the great woman theory of history, that it was all just to do with the suffragettes. They were really brave, and I'm sure they were. But what we're really talking about is much more fundamental changes to society, and those have played out, yes, in women basically being able to behave more like men than they used to be able to. Whether or not that's emancipatory, for some women it is, but there are some quite significant trade-offs as well.
I wonder if an analogy might be you are now free to work in these super dangerous, high construction, physical jobs, but that doesn't mean you want to or you should, even though you're free to do so. You can go to Alaska and be one of those crab fishermen where some significant 2%, 2-digit percentage of the men die or are seriously injured, but that doesn't mean you should or would want to.
Yeah, I mean, as it turns out, women mostly don't want. I mean, the push towards having 50-50 representation is always a push towards powerful professional jobs. No one's pushing for that in whatever construction work. I mean, I'm of the opinion that I don't think that we need 50-50 representation in every area of life, because I think men and women are fundamentally different in some really important ways, and I think that's fine. And men and women have different preferences as well, which is also fine. I'd say maybe some exceptions might be something like politics, which is probably too important to sort of accept women just naturally excluding themselves from it. Politics is also a very strange profession. So it maybe is anomalous in that sense. But yeah, in general, I think the premise that I start from my book is that I literally have a chapter called Men and Women Are Different. And I don't just mean physically, although I do mean physically. There are obviously very important physical differences between the sexes, which have become more difficult to speak about. But psychologically, I think those differences exist too, even if they're average differences, and there are lots of outliers. They're the sort of differences that on a population level become very obvious. And I think that they are morally neutral. The fact that, I don't know, women tend to be more agreeable than men, and men tend to be more risk tolerant than women. They clearly have huge social relevance, and we see them play out in all sorts of areas of life. They're not a good thing, they're not a bad thing, they're just a thing. It's just the nature of the difference. I don't think that feminism should be shy of recognizing that those differences exist. And I think actually a feminism that tries to deny those differences or even erase them is, one, on a hiding to nothing, and two, likely to actually to come up with bad ideas that actually don't serve women's interests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another way to think about this in STEM fields, there's a push, particularly in the United States, to make it more 50-50. So, math, physics, engineering, the physical sciences in general, they're not 50-50, not even really close. And yet in other fields like biological sciences, especially the social sciences, no one's arguing that there's discrimination against men from going into those fields. But the moment you flip the valence to the STEM fields, then the assumption, well, there must be some misogyny still going on. Some old guys in the departments of physics at Harvard or MIT or Caltech or something that are somehow preventing women from, breaking through the glass ceiling there, I guess. Although there was that Swedish study that showed, I think Sweden was the most open to women being in STEM fields. There were pretty much no obstacles, and still there is an unbalance there. So the assumption would be, well, just because you're free to do it doesn't mean you have to, or that you want to. Maybe people just have different interests, and women are more interested in the biological sciences, medicine. I think there's more MD women now than men, or it's pretty close to 50-50.
Yeah, and it's true in this country. There are definitely more women now graduating from medical schools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the goal would be, in a just and fair society, to remove the barriers and then just let the chips fall where they are. And if there's unbalances, so be it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the response that you'd get from, say, a woman who works in STEM, I've never worked in STEM, so I can't speak to this, but friends of mine who do, is that the problem is that if you just sort of lean into the sex differences explanation, then you potentially end up excusing all sorts of, everything from kind of trivial sexism to sexual harassment, the sort of things that drive women out of these jobs. I take that point. I also think, well, we removed the barriers to entry for all of these important professions, and women have not been averse to entering medicine at all. You now have a majority of new doctors in the UK, and I imagine probably in the States too, are now women. They have proved averse to entering, say, software engineering, and that's probably fine. I mean, my view of this whole, it's interesting how we often talk about STEM when we're talking about sex differences as the prime example, possibly because, well, there have been some particularly egregious examples like the James Damore incident at Google, which I do write about in the book. I think Damore was right, and I think that his firing was egregious. And possibly because people who work in STEM are just particularly keen to read and write about these issues. There are other areas of life with much larger differentials, like for instance in prisons, right? Like in the UK, and I believe this is true all over the world, roughly about 95% of prisoners are male, and that's a much higher proportion for violent offences. So some men's rights activists will say that this is actually to do with discrimination within the criminal justice system. They are just the flip side of the kind of fanciful blank slate feminists. It's clearly got to do with there being some very fundamental differences between men and women, particularly when you look at the age profile, because these are overwhelmingly young men who are committing these offences. You see this huge peak in teens and 20s that then tends to dwindle away. If it's all to do with socialisation, why don't old men commit nearly as much violent crime as young men do? I think it's because it's actually to do with biology.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Just give us a quick rundown on evolutionary psychology and the differences between men and women, particularly in dating and sexual behavior.
So there are a whole bunch of traits on which we see sex differences. They're very rarely absolute differences. What you're normally talking about is overlapping bell curves. So knowing someone's sex typically won't tell you where they're positioned on that spectrum. The just a non-exhaustive list on traits in which men and women differ are risk tolerance, agreeableness, neuroticism. I think there's differences on conscientiousness as well. Women are more conscientious than men on average. The really important difference for the purposes of my book is on sociosexuality, which is what psychologists call the term psychologists use to describe the desire for sexual variety. Is not quite the same thing as sex drive. Men are also higher in sex drive, but that's a little bit more dependent on age. Whereas sociosexuality seems to be a more fixed trait across someone's lifetime. And I don't think it should surprise anyone listening to hear that men are higher in, or more unrestricted, to use proper terminology, in sociosexuality than are women. They're more interested in hopping into bed with lots of people as soon as they meet them. Whereas women typically are much more orientated towards monogamy and having a trusting relationship with someone before they have sex. It is, there's a very compelling biological explanation for this, which is that we have very distinct reproductive roles. Pregnancy is much more risky for women than, well, women are the ones who get pregnant, which means 9 months of grueling and risky pregnancy, grueling and risky childbirth, and then many years of infant care. All the alternatives, which in pre 1960s are also seriously grim. Infanticide, an attempt at an abortion, whatever. Men don't have to deal with that. So in theory, men can rip and run. They can just have sex, and in theory, they can reproduce every time they have sex. Whereas women absolutely max reproducing once a year. And it just in every possible way, having sex is more expensive for women on the biological level, which means that women have evolved to be more picky about who they have sex with and much more averse to sex with strangers and sex with men who they find unattractive. It's one of the interesting things about dating app data suddenly becoming available and and offering some amazing insights into human psychology. And one interesting thing in this regard is that women regard most men as unattractive, whereas men regard most women as attractive. And that they would,
I know, it's so
would.
depressing.
I know. Well, it's just the nature of there being. David Buss has written
Yes.
lots on this, and his most recent book is called Bad Men, and he says that there's sort of an arms race in the evolutionary, in the history of our species, in that men and women want slightly different things. I mean, the goal, of course, is to reproduce and to survive. Well, that's what's favoured in the evolutionary process, but there is a slight conflict of interests, which is constantly sort of in negotiation throughout our evolutionary history, and that's what's led us to where we are now. The difference, of course, between us and other species is that we are very intelligent, and we have cultures and complex societies, and are able to some extent override our evolved instincts, not entirely. If you think of something like hunger, we might have enough intelligence and self-control to choose not to eat certain things, but we can't stop ourselves from feeling hungry, and from, we have to eat to survive. I think that sex is like that too. We can layer on complexity, we can try and regulate our instincts, but we are to some extent slaves to them. And I think we have a tendency to actually overestimate the extent to which we have complete control over our sexuality or our sexual desires.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I had David on the show here about his book. In the United States, it was called When Men Behave Badly.
Okay.
It was called Bad Men there. I don't know why publishers do that. Different titles in the UK and the US.
Yeah.
But just to put some numbers on this, length of time before engaging in sex, even in the most egalitarian countries, men prefer more sexual partners compared to women. In Norway, researchers asked people how many sex partners they would prefer over the next 30 years. On average, women preferred 5, men preferred 25. 5 times the amount. Even the desire to kiss before intercourse differs between the sexes. About 53% of men report that they would have sex without kissing, while only 14.6% of women would have sex without kissing. Choosing this versus less discerning. Studies of online dating find that most men find most women to be at least somewhat attractive. Oh, you just mentioned that. For example, on average, women view 80% of men as below average in attractiveness. Oh, man. Another study found that on the dating app Tinder, men liked more than 60% of the female profiles viewed, while women liked only 4.5%. Oh my God, these poor guys. I'm so glad I'm married and not interested in dating. Holy moly.
Me too.
God dang, that is rough, right? What men and women look for in a mate. For same-sex friends, men and women prioritize personality and social intelligence. For opposite-sex friends, though, men assign greater value on attractiveness, whereas women place greater value on economic resources and physical prowess. And I should note that these are not these are huge databases. I mean, like ends of millions. So this isn't, like asking, 45 undergraduate Psych 101 students what their preferences are, right?
Yeah.
And let's see, sexual harassment perception, since you work in this. When men were asked how would they feel if their coworker of the opposite sex asked them to have sex, 67% of men say they would be flattered, while only 15% said they would be insulted. In contrast, 63% of women said they would be insulted, and only 17% said they would be flattered. So this goes on, like how many dates would you go on before you'd be intimate with somebody on one of these dating sites? Again, huge numbers. And I think for women, the average was 7 dates before intimacy. And for the men, it was less than 1. In other words, for every guy that said 2, some guy said, why bother going on a date?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it's true, right? Like we know that this is instinctively, we know that this is how men and women tend to behave, even though, I have to do the throat clearing, there are outliers, etc. But the differences are really profound. And what I think has been encouraged in sex positive feminism is for women to basically imitate male sexuality. To if you think of the 2 bell curves of sociosexuality, to nudge the female one, further towards the male. And there are some women who sincerely enjoy casual sex and seek out sexual variety in all sorts of ways. they always carry risks that men don't carry, because they're always carrying the risks not only of pregnancy but also of violence, just because women are smaller and weaker than men, and so any kind of solo encounter is going to be more risky for the woman. There are a lot more women who aren't especially into casual sex, and there are some women who really, really don't like it, but the culture encourages it. It's not a conspiracy, you know. This isn't to do with like a small group of men getting together and plotting this. Even though, I mean, like Hugh Hefner, if anyone comes close to it, it's someone like Hugh Hefner. But it's actually got just a lot more to do with the nature of the pill's impact on making sex cheaper, essentially, by removing the likelihood of pregnancy risk. Not entirely. I mean, particularly in the early pill, you actually had quite a high failure rate, which is why you end up with a massive spike in single motherhood after the pill's introduction, which seems really perverse, doesn't it? You'd expect it to be the opposite. But it's because the pill is sufficiently effective to basically break down some of the social structures that were built up to regulate heterosexuality. So the pill destroys the shotgun marriage, for instance. But it doesn't actually eliminate the risk of unwanted pregnancy. And there are always some women who don't want to have an abortion for whatever reason. So you end up actually with an absolute increase in the amount of premarital sex that's going on. And you know, a fairly high proportion of that leads to unwanted pregnancy, and the woman ends up keeping the child and raising him or her on her own. Because there isn't the expectation anymore on men that they need to step up, that all becomes old-fashioned and a relic of the past. Which is, you know, an example, I think, of how the sexual revolution has been really, really destructive for women, for poor women in particular. That these old ideas, like you know, don't have sex outside of marriage, they are represented very often as being oppressive and ridiculous. That there's no point to them, that people just like alighted on these, either because they wanted to persecute women out of a sense of animosity, or because it was just like a weird thing that religious traditions came up with and people just ran with, as random as, you know, religious symbols or something like that. Whereas I think actually it makes perfect sense in a society without contraception to say that sex should only take place within a socially recognized relationship, i.e. a marriage. And I think it's actually in women's interests, moreover, in that kind of society, because the risk of having sex without that commitment from the male is that you end up abandoned. And in a society without a welfare state, that's a disaster. So I say, yes, marriage does oppress people, I suppose, but by design, and it oppresses both men and women in that it restricts your ability to just have sex without consequences. But the thing is that sex without consequences doesn't really exist, except for maybe a minority of men who just never find out when their girlfriends have abortions.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. One of my gay friends told me a funny joke. You know what? You know what lesbians do on a second date? They get a U-Haul trailer and they move in. You know what gay guys do on a second date? What's a second date?
Yeah, I mean, the differences between gay and lesbian cultures are very, very revealing on this front. You know, yes, there are exceptions. There are gay men who basically live like long married lesbians, and likewise there are, I mean, well, I don't know how many really promiscuous lesbians there are. There aren't, like, there's no equivalent of lesbian bathhouse culture, but clearly there is variation. But at the population level, the differences are pretty amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in a way, that explains the rapid spread of AIDS through the gay male population, because they just have so much more sex. Probabilities are just increasing of it spreading that way. Whereas if you're more choosy and selective and risk averse, then it's less likely to spread. Remember the Hugh Grant incident? I don't know. This must be 15 years ago. The British actor, you know, super handsome, dating Elizabeth Hurley, one of the most gorgeous women in the world.
Mhm.
and he gets caught having sex with a prostitute, right? I think he
Mm.
got a blowjob or something in a car, and it's like, what? Why would this guy
Mm.
have to do this? I mean, he could have any woman in the world. Anyway, he even went on the Tonight Show here with Jay Leno to joke about it and kind of, what were you thinking? Oh, I don't know. And then I saw an interview with a sex worker who explained, I can tell you exactly why, because what men are paying for is not sex, it's to have sex and then just leave with no consequence. Just walk away. What'd you call it? Rip and run, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and also not to have to pay any attention to the enjoyment of the partner.
Right. You don't
Um,
have to take them out to dinner and
yeah,
engage in conversation and actually have a relationship.
yeah, yeah, and also probably just that's kind of a drive towards like reckless sexual variety, which presumably Hugh Grant could get anywhere he likes. But yeah, like a pretty high proportion of men who buy sex are married or in relationships. So the idea that this is an idea you will sometimes get from people who are um, defenders of legalized prostitution is that these blokes couldn't otherwise get laid, but that's true. I imagine in some cases, but that's mostly not true. This is mostly more to do with this kind of drive towards sexual variety that some men have in spades.
Yeah. David and I were also talking about Joseph Smith and Mormonism when they shifted to a plural marriage, as it was called, which is only
Mm,
for the guys. Because I was talking about that book, the Under the Banner of Heaven, John Krakauer's book about the Mormons and going back to Joseph Smith and how he got a revelation from God that he has to have sex and marry this other woman down the street who he's apparently already seen, is married. And he sits his wife Emma down and says, "Well, honey, you're not going to believe this, but I've been talking to God, and He says I have to have sex with a bunch
mm.
of other women." And she's
Funny
like,
that, yeah,
"What? No
yeah,
way. In that case, I'm going to have sex with other men." He goes, "Well, no, God was very clear about this. It's just for the guys, right?" And my buddies all
yeah.
heard it, and they're telling their wives right now too. So that's how we got plural marriage. I'm sort of half
Mm,
joking about it, but David's interpretation was that was his way of dealing with the male sexual desire for variety, and he felt guilty because he's religious. And the way around that is, well, it's a religious revelation that we can do this, so it's okay.
mm, mm. Yeah, well, of course, I mean, Christianity, outside of Mormonism, is very unusual among religious traditions in its insistence on monogamous marriage, and its insistence, moreover, on male chastity outside of marriage. Very, very, very unusual, and was very unusual in the first century when it emerged. Um, I think that on balance, if you're choosing between um, Christian monogamous marriage and every other model, which I'm afraid you are, because I don't think that we have some utopian alternative around the corner. I think the Christian monogamous marriage model is actually probably the best one that there is for women
Hmm.
and for children.
I think sometimes, even though I'm an atheist, religions do get it right in the sense of they have history and they can look at the
Mm,
experiments that have been tried and say, well, that wasn't so good. Let's try this.
yeah.
And and then kind of
Yeah,
experiment.
it's a process of cultural evolution, really, isn't it? It's the successful things survive and reproduce. And Christian monogamous marriage is one of those. One of the reasons it seems that it's so prevalent around the world is because of colonialism and because Christianity, in adopting this slightly unusual model, produced a very successful society, wealthy and high functioning and able to spread itself because whatever whatever some modern progressives might say, pretty much any society that can will expand. Um, and yeah, Christians won that race at that period.
An obvious example of a problem with polygamy is the guys who don't get a wife. If one guy has
Exactly.
two, then somebody has none. Or if
Yeah.
one guy has seven, then six others have none. And you see this in the Mormons, where they actually outcast these guys who were not selected by the old guy to marry somebody. And they have to leave, or they're abused, or they're just frustrated and angry. And, it's not good.
And they make it everyone else's problem. I mean, it sort of works in Mormonism because it's within America, so you can kind of slough off the unwanted males. It wouldn't work if it was all 300 million were doing the same thing, because you'd end up with this huge population of unmarried men who are much more likely to commit crime, who are a very restless population politically, very unstable, prone to rioting, unrest of various kinds. It's a very, very, very dangerous structure actually to choose, which is one of the reasons why civilizations that opt otherwise for monogamous marriage tend to survive, because they don't have that inbuilt instability.
Yeah, didn't you write in the book something about when men get married and have kids, their testosterone levels go down and they become less violent?
Yeah,
And
yeah. It's they commit less crime. You can track the male life cycle, and you can see these dips in criminality when they have children. Yeah, particularly when they're actually living with children and looking after them, they have lower levels of testosterone and are less likely to go out and cheat and are less aggressive in every way. Clearly there are exceptions to that. People will say, "Oh, but what about men who are violent to their wives and children?" I say, of course that happens. We're talking about bigger general trends among all men.
like that Johnny Cash song, "Because You're Mine, I Walk the Line." All right, let me read you a little passage I wrote in the Moral Arc about Laura Betzig's study on biblical patriarchs. Consider the morality of the biblical warlords who had no qualms about taking multiple wives, adultery, keeping concubines, and fathering countless children from their many polygamous arrangements. The anthropologist Laura Betzig has put these stories into an evolutionary context by analyzing the Old Testament. She found no less than 41 named polygamists, not one of which was a powerless man. Quote, in the Old Testament, powerful men, patriarchs, judges, and kings have sex with more wives. They have more sex with other men's women. They have sex with more concubines, servants, and slaves, and they father many children. And not just the big names. According to Betzig's analysis, men with bigger herds of sheep and goats tend to have sex with more women than to father more children. Most of the polygynous patriarchs, judges, and kings had 2, 3, 4 wives with a corresponding number of children, although King David had more than 8 wives and 20 children. King Abijah had 14 wives and 38 children, and King Rehoboam had 18 wives and 60 other women who bore him no fewer than 88 offspring. But they were lightweights compared to King Solomon, who married at least 700 women. There were Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women he married, then for good measure added 300 concubines, which he called man's delight. What Solomon's concubines called him was never recorded.
Yes. Yeah, that's the norm, really. I mean, that's also true among chimpanzees. Not normally that extreme degree of polygamy. More like 2 wives rather than 80. But there clearly have been examples of extraordinarily large harems. And I think if you look at the dating app data, you actually see people drifting back towards that. Obviously not, we don't have yet legal polygamy, but we also don't really have any restrictions on monogamy either, because we no longer have a taboo on extramarital, premarital sex. So what you see on dating apps is because women tend to find most men unattractive, women tend to flock to the most attractive minority, who can then basically assemble kind of digital harems. Like the women often don't know the existence of the other women. They don't know that they're one of many. Either these are back-to-back relationships or simultaneous. But that's the effect, really, and it makes it's great for the attractive men. Well, it's great in the short term in that they have good time. They don't settle down in the way that actually probably longer term would be good for long-term happiness. But in the short term, it's good. It's bad for the unattractive men, or even just the averagely attractive men, because they're struggling to attract any partners at all. And it's bad for the women because they go seeking committed monogamy and they just can't find it, and they end up constantly getting going on dates, having sexual relationships with these really attractive men, and then they get ghosted, or they can never secure the commitment that they want. So everyone ends up being very dissatisfied.
Yeah, that's what brought down Tiger Woods. He had multiple women who didn't know about each other, in addition to his gorgeous wife. And then one of them found out about one of the other ones, and then I guess confronted him. And it was that big public thing with the golf club bashing in the window of his car. And then the wife finds out about it, and then it all came out. Right. Very dangerous.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. I think that's a big part of what's driving female dissatisfaction at the moment. It's partly to do with porn culture, which we might get onto, changing the sort of sexual script in a way that women don't like. It's partly to do with increased risk of some kinds of sexual violence as a result of the new norms. It's also just to do with it being really hard to kind of find a happy relationship when you have this really dysfunctional, essentially polygamous system going on now that we've got rid of the old, apparently oppressive monogamous one.
Yeah, right. Okay, let's talk about Danny Kahneman's idea of the experiencing self versus the remembered self. So you go through experiences, and as you're doing it moment to moment, you have a set of emotions about it, and then you reflect back, maybe months later, years later, or whatever, about how you feel now about it versus how you felt then about it. So when I was reading your book and then Carol's review of these other books, I couldn't help but wonder, what if some of these women actually enjoyed their 20s when they had a lot of sex and partners and it was big fun, and then they get their 30s and they think, you know what, I'm done with that now. I'm going to settle down and get married and have kids, and this is a different part of my life. But then they maybe look back on that earlier time with regret, like, you know what, that was a bad idea. So the question is, was it really a bad idea, or are they only now in hindsight saying it was a bad idea, whereas at the time they liked it? So I saw that debate you did with Ayala, is her name, the sex worker? Ayala?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ayala. And I mean, what an incredible story. I just, there was a Reason magazine interview with her where she said she makes $100,000 a month. I mean, is that possible? Is that documented? It's incredible.
I think she makes less nowadays, but at her peak.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's just amazing. I guess guys are paying for whatever it is she does with them online. But she told you that story of when she was in her 20s, living in an apartment with her girlfriends. They're having big fun, lots of sex, and so on and so forth. And that they talked about it, how much they enjoyed it. And then 10 years later, she sees one of them on social media saying something, I hated it at the time. I never liked it. And then Ayala says, I call bullshit on that. I was there. You said you liked it. So that's what made me think, is that a remembered self versus experiencing self? Is it post kind of hindsight regret, or what?
It could be all of these things. I think human beings are really complicated. It could be that Ayla's flatmate was genuinely not enjoying it and put on a brave face, because people are very good at that. And it's a very common experience, for instance, for women in much worse situations, say abusive relationships. When they're in the relationship, they tell everyone it's fabulous, and then it's only later that they have sufficient emotional distance to be able to say otherwise. So sometimes that happens. It might be that women regret sleeping around in their 20s because it's now made it more difficult for them to secure committed monogamous relationships and start families, which is a sort of thing that you don't necessarily think about when you're
Why would that be?
age. Partly because men have a bias against women they perceive to be promiscuous when it comes to choosing marriage partners. That I think we mentioned already, the sexual double standard among Mormons. The men can be as promiscuous as they like, but their women aren't allowed to be. That's extremely common across societies because of evolution, because something that men are anxious about is paternal certainty, knowing for sure that the child that they're investing their resources in is their own child and not some other man's. And the only way of guaranteeing paternal certainty is to keep tabs on your partner. Whereas women tend to be more forgiving of promiscuity in men. And the sexual double standard is still alive and well. Men don't mind a woman who they perceive as promiscuous if they're only looking for a casual relationship. But if they're looking for a long-term relationship, they mind more. It's not necessarily a deal breaker, and a very attractive woman. I'm sure if Ayla ever decides to settle down, she will be able to find someone who's willing to who she's beautiful and intelligent, and I'm sure it will be fine. But it is a mark against women in the sexual marketplace when it comes to marriage, and so that might be the sort of reason why women don't necessarily know that. Women are sometimes remarkably unaware of the realities of male sexuality, and men likewise. I think that there's an amazing degree of mutual miscomprehension between the sexes, which is partly because I think as a culture we're not honest about those differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think every incoming freshman should read your book and David Buss's book about men. Just, this is the
I think so
reality,
too.
right? Yeah. I mean, there was that study, David talks about this, where a shill for the experimenter walks up to a member of the opposite sex and says, I found you attractive and was wondering if you'd go out with me tonight. And then the second scenario was, I saw you there and found you attractive. Wonder if you go back to my apartment with me tonight. And the third scenario was, I found you attractive and wonder if you'd have sex with me tonight. Right. So then there was, males asking females and females asking men, and, just massive difference, of course,
Yeah.
where not one woman said yes to the third scenario. Right. And very few to the second scenario, and maybe half to the first scenario. Whereas the men, it was, sure, what time should I go? Right.
Yeah.
So then I'm telling this story to, I had a guest, I forget who it was now, but it was kind of a progressive feminist, and said, oh, well, that was debunked because it was a safety issue. It's not that women don't want the same variety as men. It's just that they're worried about their safety. So if you said, and by the way, it was someone like, if it was Brad Pitt going back to that, asking you this, and it was 100% guaranteed, it would just be a safe experience, just as many women would say yes. So then I asked David about that, and he said, oh, no, well, yeah, it bumped it up from like 0 saying yes to like 2 said yes, right? It's still massive differences.
Yeah. It can't just be put down to that kind of practical concern, because we see these differences in male and female sexuality across so many different on dating apps and in erotic fiction. The differences between say romance novels written for a female audience and pornography intended for a male audience are very illustrative of the differences between male and female sexuality. One of the things that's very striking in all kinds of erotic or romance fiction intended for women is that women are never, ever, ever interested in a male who is not interested in them. There's never a kind of coercive fantasy where a woman encourages an unwilling man into sex. The male hero, romantic hero, is always often obsessively attracted to the female heroine. Because again, it comes back to this issue of, if you're going to have a sexual relationship with a man and risk pregnancy, you want to be damn sure that he is going to invest in you, is going to stay with you, and provide resources to you and to your child. It makes perfect sense. And the problem, I think, with trying to override that instinct, which women do, a lot of women now will have a period of having casual relationships, and some of them, like, I believe Ayla when she tells me that she's really is like unrestricted in sociosexuality. Like, she actually craves sexual variety and adventure. There are women who are like that, but most women kind of make the best of it, or put up with it, or suppress feelings of distress, and would prefer committed monogamy if they could secure it. But it's just harder to secure it in a sexual marketplace, which is actually more orientated, I think, now towards male preferences rather than female.
Through the dating sites, you mean?
Just in general,
Oh, in
also
general.
on wherever university campuses, big cities. You can see this in terms of the sexual makeup of sort of closed dating environments like universities, or like cities like London, for instance, have an excess of young single women, because women are more likely to be, because more women are now graduating from universities, and they flock to cities like London because that's where the graduate jobs are. And when there is an excess of women, the norms within that dating market become more masculine. So you have sex more quickly and so on. when there are an excess of men and women therefore have more choosing partner, you see the opposite, and you see a trend towards more monogamy.
Right. So, just in general, why is the government in the business of marriage? I've often thought about this kind of politically from a libertarian perspective. Just let people do whatever they want to do. If you want to get married, fine. If you want to have a contract and just live together, that's fine. Let people do whatever they want. Would your answer be something like, because marriage is good for society in the same way that home ownership is? So I get to write off the interest on my mortgage, for example. This is the government telling me, we like you to own homes. So in a way, I get a write-off because I'm married and I have a kid, so I get another write-off. And that's the government's way of saying, we think marriage is good.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bigger story here about the government becoming ever larger as it's taking over functions previously performed by the church and the family. So it used to be that the government didn't care very much about your sexual relationships because the church and the family cared a great deal. Whereas now the church and the family have retreated, and so you have the government taking over various tasks, including regulation of relationships. I mean, I do think marriage is better in general. There's copious data. I have it in chapter 8 on why marriage is better, particularly for children. And so I think given that the government does have to make choices on things like tax regimes, I think that those choices the thumb on the scale should be in favor of marriage rather than against it, which is not currently the case, actually. I mean, I can't speak to America, which is obviously more complex as well because of states. But in the UK, for instance, single earner households actually are weighted against in our tax system. You end up paying more tax if you have a traditional nuclear model than if you have two parents earning. So it's not the case currently in UK policy, government policy, that everything's weighted towards the old-fashioned model. Quite the opposite.
Is that because of political pressure against that? Because it's unfair to people who are not married? Something like that?
It depends on your interpretation of the history, because this comes in the 1990s, this particular arrangement where you can't transfer your tax-free allowance to your spouse. So therefore you lose the tax-free allowance if you just have a single earner. And I think it is a combination of the government wanting women back into the workplace and increasing the amount of tax revenue, because stay-at-home mums don't pay tax. And it's a combination of feminist pressure, that there was a feeling, still is among many feminists, that you don't want the government providing any barriers to women re-entering the workforce. The problem is that most women don't actually want to re-enter the workforce. Really, it's not full time. The most popular option among women with little children is to either not work at all or to work part time and to be supported by a spouse. Most people actually would prefer to be a little bit old-fashioned. The proportion of women who really want to work full time, I think, when they have little children, I think is about 20%. But by definition, those women are going to be more present in, the corridors of power. Not as present as women who don't have children at all. There's an amazing disproportionality of childless women among, say, senior political roles and so on across the world.
I often wondered if, feminists pushing for women autonomy and independence and being in the workplace and so on, and even the more extreme versions of it's better to have a career than a child, like you can't have both or something, is in a way playing into the so-called patriarchy, of you can be like a man, but what's wrong with wanting to be a mom? In a way, they're kind of saying women should be more like men, but shouldn't women just be women? Why aren't
Or
feminists
maybe
pushing
men should
that?
be more like women, even. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, feminism of that stripe has been really, really successful in breaking down barriers to some women in particular becoming more like men. And some of those women have done very well by that. And for them, it's a great achievement. What feminism has been bad at is raising the status of feminine behavior. because I mean, I generally don't use the word patriarchy. I don't think it's a very useful term because it's so vague. But I think there is something, I think what often people are describing when they talk about patriarchy is this slightly vague sense of women being lower status than men. The fact that it's very easy to persuade women to clamour at the gates of, masculine work, and very difficult to persuade men to be stay-at-home mums and do the washing up. It's just proved to be really hard to sort of see those two enterprises as genuinely equal in status, because for some reason women just seem to have it's not misogyny. I mean, like there's a cognitive bias you might have come across called the women are wonderful bias. If you ask people to say you have some thought experiment where you've got a man and a woman who need to be saved from a burning building, people will overwhelmingly save the woman. Women do benefit from that kind of benevolent sexism or chivalry. But equally, women do tend to be consigned generally to the lower status role and across societies as well. There's a theory, it's something that gets debated among anthropologists. My first degree was in anthropology. And one quite persuasive theory is that it's because women are associated with children. And so there's something about that association, there's sort of a transfer of the infantile status to women a little bit. And clearly that feeling of being infantilized really rubs at some women, and this has been the kind of driving force behind so much of the clamor to be more like men.
Oh, interesting. You mean so like the Titanic, women and children first into the lifeboats thing, that got flipped to you're infantilizing women when you say that?
I think it's I mean, yeah, so some women don't like, I mean, I think they'd probably still take the spot in the lifeboat, but
Yeah, I would hope so.
yeah. But some women don't like that suggestion that women are in any way in need of particular care, or prioritization in any way. I think that's silly because I think, look, women are just smaller and weaker than men. That's the reality of it, and we're made more vulnerable still by childbearing and breastfeeding and all of the work associated with reproduction. So, like, either you accept that chivalry is actually beneficial, or you kind of leave women to their own devices and actually end up suffering for it. So.
Hmm. Let's talk about sexual violence since you worked in a battered women's center or whatever you call it in England. So it's obvious from what we've talked about why men are more violent than women. And then for something like BDSM, that's more of a male desire than a female desire, although there's obvious overlapping bell curve there. Some women seem to like it. There was a famous story here last year. The Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team, their star pitcher, a guy named Bauer, got Me Too'd by his date or girlfriend or whatever, that he choked her to the point where she thought she was going to die. And then in his defense, he presents to the public, he posts it online, all her texts in which he's going, "Oh, I like it. I like it when you choke me," or whatever. And then her response to that was, "Well, yeah, but it went too far. I liked a little bit of this," and then he took it further, and maybe she gave the safe word or whatever, and he ignored it, something like that.
It's a very good reason why you shouldn't ask your partner to choke you.
Yeah,
It's an
right.
incredibly reckless thing to do. Trying to ride the tiger of male sexual energy is just really hard, particularly if
Yeah,
everyone's drunk.
right, right, yeah,
Mm.
right. So then a question is, why do women stay in battered relationships? That you always hear that question. What is your answer to that?
It's normally, one of the arguments that you'll hear against marriage is that marriage ends up trapping women in abusive relationships. Nowadays, actually, unmarried couples are more likely to be abusive couples than married. So the
Hmm.
relationship isn't that strong. Well, the relationship doesn't exist, at least now. Um, it's because the thing that keeps women in abusive relationships is psychological. It's not to do with legal forms. I mean, you obviously don't want it so that women are legally restricted from leaving abusive relationships, but that's normally not the thing that keeps them coming back. There seems to be an adaptation in women, colloquially often called Stockholm syndrome. You won't really hear that phrase used in the women's sector anymore because it's a bit old-fashioned, but the becoming attached to a violent man in proximity to you. Basically, it's not unique to women. I mean, the original event for which it's named actually involved some male hostages who had the same effect, but it's something we see more often in women for some reason. And there is a theory that it's actually adaptive because there were so many cases in our evolutionary history of women being captured in warfare and claimed as wives by these new men who just killed these women's families, that the women who were able to come to terms with that and to bond with their captors were the women who are most likely to survive and reproduce. So it's kind of grim, but there might be a kind of seed of something in there that actually has in other times and places being adaptive, but isn't now. I don't know. There's a lot of different theories on it. It's hard. It's hard to be sure.
There has to be some economics in there too, just the sense that I don't have any other options to support myself.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, it depends on the dynamics. I mean, a lot of these men who are serial abusers, they don't really have jobs. Like they're not really providing for the women that they're abusing. Some of them are. I mean, there are a whole range of different models.
Let me read to you Carol's conclusions about these books. He says, after devoting many years to the scientific study of women's heterosexual experiences through reading, observing, listening, and participating, I've drawn a few conclusions. 1, many women like sex when it brings erotic pleasure and they like the guy. This is called good sex. Many women don't like sex when the guy is a dork, rude, thoughtless, clumsy, coercive, or violent. This is called bad sex. Many women enjoy hookups, short affairs, conference connections, orgies, planned and spontaneous, and adventures with multiples and variations of all kinds. This is called having fun. 4, many number 3 women get tired after a few years. Oh God, Marie, another orgy? Whereas others make it a way of life. This is called being in the lifestyle. And 5, many women prefer sex with one doting partner at a time, the time lasting from as long as love does, from a week to a lifetime. This is called a loving relationship. So she's kind of giving a little variation there of human variation.
I mean, I don't deny the existence of the having fun gals. They exist. They're just not representative. And the problem is that if they tend to be overrepresented in the media, right? Anyone who's writing a sex column or writing about Sex and the City, shows like Sex and the City, is going to be drawn from that group because it's really boring to write a sex column about your happy monogamous
Right.
marriage.
We had sex again, the same way we always do.
Right. Or indeed a sitcom. Like, it just doesn't make for good content. So you tend to see a lot of these women in talking in public. I mean, I also sort of think that if you're willing to write about your sex life in public, that probably suggests that you have some boundary issues, full stop, because, most women who, and indeed men who are in happy monogamous relationships, would not write about their sex lives in public because it would embarrass their spouse. Which is why you end up only really hearing from the kind of wild girls. It's fine, they exist. I'm not trying to dampen their fun, but I am saying that we can't establish a sexual culture around their preferences because their preferences are unusual.
Yeah, Carol points out, well, here she's commenting on Nona Willis Aronwitz's book called Bad Sex, first noting that she's the daughter of the brilliant feminist Ellen Willis, who tackled these same questions a generation earlier. So Carol's kind of asking, why are these books coming out now? We were talking about this back in the day, right? So maybe these things kind of come around. Although she does comment on Nona Willis's a little bit of TMI is an understatement, she says. In other words, readers can be forgiven for asking, what bad sex? The book is a litany of the many orgasms she's had, hours and hours of cunnilingus with this lover and that one, anal, oral, sideways, multiples, the fantastic lovers, the terrible lovers, how she loves dick, experiments with other women, passionate weekends. The bad sex of the title is mostly bad relationships, hookups with men who were selfish or otherwise unlikable, or in the case of the partner she leaves at the onset of her story, relationships that have become sexually boring.
Yeah, and I haven't read the book, but I believe from the reviews that I've read of the book that doesn't leave her very happy.
Yeah, well, so Carol rewrites a passage that Nona had written and wonders how the same narrative would sound if it was written by a man. Quote, I left my otherwise loving partner whom I loved because I got bored with her and our sex life, and I didn't like her off-putting smell that ruined our sexual chemistry. I'm happy to report other intimate details about her that annoyed me, but I won't bother you with her perspective on me. I will tell you about my many lovers so you will understand how desirable I am, including that amazing afternoon in which I received one blowjob after another. I confess that certain body shapes and sizes turned me on. Unfortunately, along with the hot women I couldn't get enough of, at least until I tired of them, I hooked up with some awful women too. Demanding, rude, not communicative about their desires, egocentric, etc. Wait, one of those impersonal hookups was a very nice person. So if a guy wrote that now, it'd be like, oh, what a pig.
Yeah, but it's also a completely typical life story of like a male chauvinist pig, of which there have been many and continue to be many. I mean, because this is exactly it, that the sex positive feminism misconceives as liberation, basically just behaving like an asshole.
Right. Yeah.
Rather than saying, as I do, that actually a sexual culture in which men behaved more like women, imitated female sexuality, would actually be better for women.
Yeah. All right, let me just kind of wrap up here by asking you about a couple other controversial issues. You don't have to comment if you don't want on trans matters.
No,
You
that's
know,
fine. Happy to.
you're happy to?
Yeah, I don't write about it in the book, but I've
Yeah,
written about
I know, I know.
it
Yeah.
elsewhere.
So
Yeah.
what's going on, or why are we experiencing this, massive interest in trans and so forth?
In terms of the backlash against it, or in terms of where
Well,
where the movement has come from.
let me tee it up slightly differently. So there are trans. It's real. It's a vanishingly small fraction, 0.1% or whatever people and so on. But all of a sudden, there's like a 4,000% spike in people who identify as trans in just the last like 3 years. So one hypothesis is the social contagion theory, because it happens in one age cohort, usually teenage to early 20s. And then the other hypothesis is that no, society is more liberal and tolerant, so more and more people are coming out. We had the women, civil rights and women's rights and gay rights and so far. Now trans rights is the next one, and they're coming out, and that's the real number.
No, I think there probably is. Gender dysphoria may well be innate to a very small proportion of people, although there clearly is in the anthropological and historical data. There are various people who inhabit third sex roles or who cross-dress for various reasons, but they tend not to do so in the model that we're familiar with in the 21st century. And to say that it's the same is, I think, being very present-centric. For instance, it's quite common to have a third sex, which is basically consigned for feminine gay males. You see that across a lot of cultures. Probably the Indian hijra would be the most famous example. But that's not there are a lot of subgroups within the Western trans population, and that's only one of them. You're probably familiar with Ray Blanchard's typology of
Yeah, review that for us real quick.
so Blanchard, I can't remember exactly when he first came up with this typology, possibly 1990s. He's a Canadian sexologist. He says that there are two quite distinct subgroups of male trans people, so people born male who identify as women. One is group of men who are exclusively attracted to other men and who are gay, in other words, and who tend to be very feminine from childhood and very gender non-conforming in a really persistent way, and tend to want to transition young and often pass quite well as well, because they tend to be quite sort of petite and pretty. And then there's another group who Blanchard describes as autogynephilic. That's the term he came up with, who are straight men who are attracted to women, and their motivation for transitioning is paraphilic. That they're basically cross-dressing is one manifestation of this, that they are aroused by the thought of themselves as women, and the full expression of that desire is to transition. I mean, normally not actually through having genital surgery, but through living as women and having female identities and so on. Because talking about that kind of sexual desire is embarrassing and shameful, most autogynephilic transgender people won't express it in those terms and will kind of allied their life story with the homosexual category. But there are ways in which they're distinct. I mean, one, they only ever have sexual relationships with women. Two, they tend to transition later in life. Three, they tend to be actually quite stereotypically masculine and gender conforming, and often have been in the military or in other kind of male dominated fields. It seems that it's the autogynephilic population that's been growing in recent decades. And then there's also, of course, the female counterpart, which is completely different again, in that you have women who sometimes it's women who are lesbians and often very masculine in an innate way, and feel more comfortable nowadays. I mean, lots of people have written, including Katie Herzog, American journalist, about the disappearance of lesbian subculture because just so many lesbians are now transitioning. You also have teenage girls increasingly. I mean, that's the real spike, is among teenage girls identifying as trans or non-binary, who often have a lot of other mental health things going on, and in another era would probably have been anorexic, or some other kind of contagious mental illness. Teenage girls are very vulnerable to contagious mental illnesses. So, yeah, anyway, like it means when you talk about trans, you're talking about a whole bunch of other things, but they are all subject to cultural forces. We're not just talking about a kind of clear biomedical category of people who have gender dysphoria and that's it. You know, this is very, very much a 21st century phenomenon.
Yeah, Andrew Sullivan makes the point that because he's a gay guy, that these 13, 14-year-old boys that are teenagers that are interested in other boys, that's who they're attracted to, and now they're being told, no, actually you're straight, you're not gay, and you just are in the wrong body. And
Yeah, I
he
mean, yeah,
considers that to be homophobic.
yeah. I mean, Iran is the world leading country in sex reassignment surgeries because being gay is illegal. The state actually encourages you to transition. Yeah, there's definitely an argument for it being motivated by homophobia. I think that was also more true early on, when you had parents who were very uncomfortable with their sons being gay and would push them in this direction. I think since the trans movement has become really mainstream, that's probably a bit less true, and you've got more people who are attracted to the sort of almost avant-garde kind of subculture.
I've often wondered the enthusiasm or aggression of trans activists against people like you or Helen Joyce, myself, others who say, hang on, it is driven by a sense of like moral progress. What can we do? We've already had civil rights, women's rights, gay rights. What's left? Trans rights. And I'm going to be passionate about it. I'm going to get out there and march, and I'm going to be an activist because this is my time. And you are standing in my way, therefore you're a transphobe, or you're the equivalent of a racist or a white supremacist, something like that.
I think some of them that's definitely true, particularly the cis straight female allies. I think have really adopted this cause because it does seem as though it's, civil rights 3.0 or whatever. And I think there's also that urge towards, it comes back to female agreeability, the urge towards protecting the vulnerable, and trans people have been cast in as the sort of most vulnerable group in society role, which is very attractive to sort of people who want to save them as part of their political cause. The really vehement trans activism, like death threats and rape threats, edge of trans activism, I think is mostly driven by the a handful of the autogynephilic group who are ashamed of their true motivations for transitioning and take that rage out on women. It is interesting that it mostly tends to be women who get the really, really sharp end of the hatred, like J.K. Rowling, for instance. Helen Joyce has had her fair share, whereas men seem to be able to get away with more, which is probably explained by that autogynephilic dynamic, which no one wants to talk about, but
Interesting. Yeah. Why is
no,
that?
because it's embarrassing, I guess, and because, yeah, and because it seems like such an appalling thing to say that someone is motivated by a fetish.
Mm. Just to
But
help me understand this, because
mm,
I don't know that much about it. So, guys are really attracted to women's bodies, very visual, right?
mhm.
99% of porn is consumed by men and so forth. And maybe in some ways, even sexier than a naked woman body that you're looking at is one in bra and panties. So, is it an extension of that? Like, yeah, I'm turned on by panties, and putting them on, wearing them is even more arousing for some people. Is it an extension of that kind of natural visual thing, or is it something different entirely?
I think I can't remember exactly the acronym now, but the term that Blanchard and other sexologists use is, I think, erotic target identity inversion. I might be getting
Oh,
that
wow.
wrong.
Oh,
It's
wow.
erotic target something.
Mm.
It's basically, I think the theory is that there's a sort of confusion in the brain between desiring, the object of your desire being a beautiful woman as a sort of external object, that it gets flipped and the idea of oneself being the beautiful woman becomes what's really arousing. Um, I mean, again, coming back to the differences between male and female sexuality, fetishes or paraphilias are almost exclusively found in men. It's very rare for women to. It depends on what you class as a paraphilia. So women are more likely to have, say, to be masochists. Some people would argue that's just an extreme version of normal female sexuality. Um, it's among men that you get, the weird sexual obsessions. Um, I don't think we know exactly why, except that it does seem to be a feature of male sexuality exclusively, which is why you see something like autogynephilia only in men. There isn't a female counterpart to it.
Interesting. A couple semesters ago, I had a female student in my class at Chapman. It's 25 students, so it's kind of a seminar, lots of discussion. And in the mid semester, she announced she was she was transitioning to male, getting the surgery right away. But
Mhm.
she cut her hair, changed her name, started wearing guys' clothes, and so on. But it became evident to me in the course of multiple conversations, because she got tons of attention from the other students, like, "Oh my God, this is so interesting," and kind of love bombed and so on.
Mhm.
That it wasn't that she wanted to be a man; she wanted to be trans, because that was kind of a cool thing to be.
Yeah.
Because she wasn't doing anything that made her look at all really like a man. I mean, you can cut your hair and all that, but the female body types are just so different, face, everything. Um, it's just that. So that struck me like, okay, there's something. This was maybe 2 years ago, actually now. So just as that wave was starting, and I
Mm.
thought, okay, so trans is sort of a thing, as its own self, is its own category.
Yeah, it's a subculture. It's like being a punk for
Mm,
some people. Yeah. It's better than being a punk though, because it's a cool subculture and you get loads of sort of positive attention for being brave.
yes, brave, courageous, and brave. Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. But here, you're not just dyeing your hair or painting your nails black or or getting a tattoo. The surgeries and the hormone treatments. This is the
That's the
problem.
problem. Yeah,
Yeah.
when you've got this irreparable interventions,
Yeah.
and that we don't really understand the long-term effects. And to the extent that we do, they don't seem to be very good.
Do you think that pendulum is going to swing back soon? Do you think it could be triggered by lawsuits against medical centers that conduct these surgeries without parental consent or whatever?
I think the movement has already peaked,
Mm,
and we are seeing that more in the UK so far, but that we are seeing lawsuits and intense anxiety among parents and schools and so on. I think that certainly to the extent that it among the group of young women mostly for whom this is a contagious mental illness, I think that it will definitely fade away because they all do eventually, and it will be replaced by something else. The problem is, of course, that you've now got a lot of people who have permanently altered their genitals, had double mastectomies, suspended puberty. You know, puberty blockers are not benign. They cause all sorts of permanent changes to the brain and the body. We've done this really experimental thing on mostly children, and that can't be repaired. So in that sense, I think it's worse than, say, the multiple personalities craze, which is
Recovered
very
memory
similar.
movement.
Yeah, which is very, I mean, clearly also was destructive in its way, but it didn't have the permanent effects on the body. So I think this is probably a more destructive and also, I think, a more successful movement, or more impactful movement,
I
but
should
similar in ways.
I should know parenthetically that student also revealed that she had been seeing a psychiatrist throughout high school. She was on different meds. She had depression, anxiety, said she was on the spectrum, and so on. So it was kind of a host of things going on at the same time.
Yeah,
That
that's
probably
very
would
typical.
surprise you. Okay, last big subject, abortion.
Oh
Since
my goodness.
you don't write about this in your book, if I recall, but maybe you've
Not
commented.
really,
I have
no.
no idea what your position is and how you think about that in the context of women's rights and all the stuff we're talking about here.
Safe, legal, and rare is my
Safe, legal, and
position.
rare. I like that.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's most people's position, actually, aside from some extremists on each side. Um, yeah, I mean, I basically hold the view of pretty much the modal American and British voter, which is, I think, that abortion is a bad, sad thing that has to sometimes happen. I'm actually working on a much longer essay about this at the moment, if anyone
You
wants to.
are. Oh,
Yeah.
good.
For First Things. So,
What's the thesis, or what's your angle?
that's de-Christianization is potentially ushering in not the kind of gentle, scientifically informed secularism that we hoped it would, but rather a repaganization, returning to being actually much more like ancient Rome.
Really interesting. Okay,
Yeah,
so
about 4,000 words on the subject coming out soon.
wow. Okay, you have to send that to me.
I will.
Right. So the argument is again that Christianity, or maybe religion, it has it's discovered some good rules that are norms that guide people's behavior. Otherwise, you end up in ancient Rome, where it's eat, drink, and be merry, and maybe that's not so good for
I,
mental
th-
health and physical
I
health.
think I think specifically that Christianity has a very unusual feature of Christianity, which is not shared with paganism or with almost any other faith tradition, is that Christianity valorizes weakness and vulnerability and doesn't worship the strong, but actually does the opposite. Says that the most valuable people in a society are the poor, the disabled, children. You know, I think that feminism's moral force really comes from Christianity, or the vestiges of Christianity, in that feminism says that yes, women may be smaller and weaker than men, but actually that's a good thing, or that's certainly that women are therefore deserving of protection, not of persecution and hatred. And I think that one of the outcomes of that way of thinking is that Christians are very opposed to abortion, because what is more small and vulnerable than anyone? It's the unborn child. And I think therefore that the package deal of Christianity, that if you have this preoccupation with inverting the normal strength weakness hierarchy, is yes, you will leave space for feminism, but you will also probably be pro-life. And also oppose euthanasia, and all of these things which are considered to be fairly not just acceptable but unremarkable in a lot of cultures. And I think that yes, Christianity, there are trade-offs with that, quite serious ones. But I think that if you liked Christian patriarchy, you will love post-Christian patriarchy, which is a hell of a lot worse.
Interesting. Are you a Christian?
I'm an agnostic Christian.
Oh, so you don't believe in God,
No,
but
but I'm
but
I'm
but
kind of emotionally drawn to Christianity and intellectually drawn
but
to Christianity. But
the social structure, the kind of moral norms aspect of it, you appreciate.
increasingly with time. Yeah, I was a teenage atheist.
You were a teenager. There's the title of your next book. I was a teenage atheist. Now I've shifted to agnostic. Well, your countryman there, Thomas Henry Huxley, coined the term agnostic, by which he meant
Mm,
not knowable, not like we
mm.
use it colloquially today, meaning I'm keeping an open mind, could go either way. I'm waiting to see. But no, it's not knowable in some ultimate
I mean
ontological sense.
that's what I mean. Yeah,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I don't know, and I don't think any of us can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do think, along with Pinker and others, that, we can kind of structure a moral system based on secular values, much of which I think corresponds well to the Christian worldview. If you read
Yeah.
like Steve Pinker's The Blank Slate, where he's very critical of blank slateism. And he talks about Thomas Sowell's book on human nature, different theories of human nature, And basically liberals have this kind of blank slate model where, people are born good and then social institutions that are unequal make them bad. Whereas Sowell and Pinker and myself and others that don't believe in the blank slate recognize, as do Christians, that actually we're born sinful. I mean, we have inner demons that are there. They're real, and we need to ride herd over those with our better angels, which societies can do by kind of attenuating the one and accentuating the other. And there, I think the Christian worldview got it mostly right. And that if you don't have these 10 commandments, whatever you want to choose, most of them, have some value in history. Like, here's what happens when these systems break down, and it's not good.
Yeah, yeah. The book that's had a real impact on me is Tom Holland's Dominion, which is about the enduring impact of Christianity on the West, and he would say that secular humanism is just Christianity without anything upstairs.
Right.
It's basically that the shadow of the Christian virtues and Christian symbolism, but with theology removed. The question is whether actually that's durable. Can you have basically Christianity without the theology, and can you have it lasting? I don't know if you can.
Well, and we should say Judeo-Christian, although from the passages I read earlier from the Old Testament about, these patriarchs and all their wives and concubines and so forth, Christianity and Judaism have both gone through the Enlightenment, right? Whereas Islam really has not gone through an Enlightenment. Oh, I'll tell you a funny story. So my wife's from Cologne, Germany, so we were just there last week. And so we took an Uber ride somewhere, and I always like to chat it up with the Uber drivers. This guy said he was from Syria. He was 28 years old, and he's been here 7 years. So I thought, oh, this is about the time that Angela Merkel opened up the borders, right? So tell me your story. He gave me the whole story. It was incredible. On this little boat that holds 20 people, there's like 100 people on the boat, and they try it over and over and over, and all the hardships, and he finally makes it to Germany. And now he's living in Cologne, which is this very libertine, very kind of sort of the gay capital of Europe and so on. So we got talking about that, and then he's a Muslim, and he's like, oh well, we can't have that. Like, we can't have what? Well, we can't have those gays, because if it was just gays and lesbians, then there'd be no children, and then that would be the end of civilization. He did one of these kind of thought experiments, and slippery slope. If everybody's gay, there's not going to be any more babies. So my wife says, well, get started, dude. Come on. Are you gay? He goes, oh, not me. It's like, okay, well then, start making some babies. He goes, well, I don't have a girlfriend. And I thought, oh, that's a shocker. I wonder why.
Yeah, it's true here as well that London is both the nation's capital for multiculturalism and also for homophobia, because
Right.
lo and surprise, actually most people outside of
Right.
outside of the West are not.
But just one more point on the abortion thing. So your concern is that, so you often hear people, well, what about rape and incest? There should be exceptions for that and so forth. That's pretty rare, right? I mean, most abortions are just accidentally got pregnant, the birth control failed, or the guy didn't put the condom on or whatever, and I'm not ready economically or emotionally for a baby. I'm going to have an abortion. That's probably the majority, right? Not rape and incest.
Yeah.
So your concern would be, let's not treat it as a form of birth control.
I mean, I don't think it's in women's interest to treat it like a form of birth control, because abortion is not a nice thing to go through. It's painful, it's upsetting. There's a completely pro-woman argument to be made. I don't think that we should be pushing at that, though, from the legislative point. I don't think that we should be radically restricting abortion access, because I think that the likely consequence of that is actually just more mayhem and misery the people who are already suffering. I
Especially
would,
poor people.
yeah, I would prefer to see women not having sexual relationships with men who don't give a damn if they get hit by a bus next week. That would be top of my list. I would prefer to see a more genuinely pro-natalist culture, because I think that actually we have a culture in which it's extraordinarily difficult to raise a family, to get on the housing ladder, to negotiate work. And I mean, we now so much have an economy in which you are obliged to have two incomes, which obviously makes it extremely difficult when a baby comes along. So these and therefore you do have families who or have women who choose to abort rather than bring another baby into the world that they can't afford. So I think there are other ways of pushing at that without legal restrictions on abortion.
I try to appeal to conservatives and pro-lifers that our goal should be mutual, fewer unwanted pregnancies. Abortion's not the
Yeah,
problem; it's unwanted pregnancies.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
that end, here I'll finish with your final chapter, which is called "Listening to Your Mother." Listen to your mother. So the Fox News people are going to love this. They-
They have it. Yeah, they do.
you see, this liberal says we were right. Anyway, get drunk and high. Get drunk or high in private and with female friends rather than in public or in mixed company. Don't use dating apps. Mutual friends can vet histories and punish bad behavior. Dating apps can't. Hold off on having sex with a new boyfriend for at least a few months. Is a good way of discovering whether or not he's serious about you or just looking for a hookup. Only have sex with a man if you think he would make a good father to your children. That's a good one. That would eliminate probably most guys right off the bat.
Yeah, that was the goal.
It would reduce that 4.5% down to about 1%.
Yeah.
And then monogamous marriage is by far the most stable and reliable foundation on which to build a family. Not just here, you don't mean just politically or socially good thing for the government to do. You mean for women. It's a good thing for women.
Yeah, on an individual level, yeah.
Yeah. All right, Louise, thank you so much for your work. Your book is great. Super
Thank you.
interesting subjects. Of course, everyone likes to talk about sex and so on. So your next big paper article is on abortion. We want to read about that. Then what's the next book? What are you researching?
I'm thinking of writing a book called The Case for Having Kids, a sequel to this one. On the flip side of it, you know, we've broken the link between sex and reproduction. I want to write a book about the reproduction side.
And you have a toddler, and you're going to have more?
Yeah, who will surely impede the writing of that book.
That's right. Right. Very good. All right. Thank you so much. That was great. Good
Thank
conversation.
you.